I'm going to let you in on an open secret. I have no talent in mixing music or t-shirt design. I cannot do an English accent, Irish accent, or Afrikaans accent to save my life. Nor do I have the vocal range to give you the deep-voiced opening you hear at the start of each episode. The good news for me is there is always Fiverr. Fiverr.com allows you to hire freelancers for sometimes as little as $5 to do tasks that you have to get done for your business. Or sing happy birthday to your spouse in ways that are impossible for you. Or, honestly, the list could go on. Help yourself and help the show by using the link I provide in the show notes to see if Fiverr's freelancers can help you. Or if you have anything to offer Fiverr. My show was not possible without Fiverr. Some meaningful work in your life may now become possible with Fiverr. Go ahead and open the link in our show notes right now. Before we start this series on concentration camps, I wanted to warn you that there is going to be some very dark, disturbing content. It was really painful at times for me as a father of a 7-month-old and a husband to read through some of the history on this stuff. I also want to warn you on a lighter note that there is going to be some serious butchering of Spanish and German, despite my best efforts to find the right pronunciations. All right, you're officially warned. Here we go.
This is Forgotten Wars.
Samuel Maharero led an uprising in southern Africa, in the colony of German Southwest Africa. This Herero chief sabotaged railway lines to the coast about 100 miles away and scored several early victories against the colony's settlers and rulers. Samuel and many Herero had had enough mistreatment from German traders. The governor of the colony, though, held optimism that he could reach a peace settlement. German Southwest Africa's governor, Theodore Lutwine, had, after all, bribed and played rival tribal leaders off of each other quite effectively for years. But Kaiser Wilhelm II and his German high command would not tolerate a settlement. They told Governor Lutwine to get nothing short of unconditional surrender. Lutwine started to worry that the German high command's real plan was to exterminate the Herero. Lutwine told his superiors not to listen to those, quote, fanatics who want to see the Herero destroyed altogether, and to remember that they needed the natives for the colony's economy. His words fell on deaf ears. Then his words were muted 3 months later when he was relieved of his command. A new man set foot on German Southwest African ground, someone willing to do whatever it took to achieve his results. General Lothar von Tota brought previous experience from Africa and from China. General von Tota also brought a propensity for brutality. For his first 2 months on the ground, von Tota planned an offensive, a mousetrap. Von Tota crushed most of Herero's forces in August at Waterberg, taking no prisoners, at least officially. Then von Tota issued this uniquely brutal proclamation, quote, I, the great general of the German troops, send this letter to the Herero people. The Herero are no longer German subjects. They have murdered and stolen. They have cut off the ears, noses, and other body parts of wounded soldiers. Now, out of cowardice, they no longer wish to fight. I say to the people, anyone who delivers a captain will receive 1,000 mark. Whoever delivers Samuel Herero will receive 5,000 mark. The Herero people must, however, leave the land. If the populace does not do this, I will force them with the Grautruher cannon. Within the German borders, every Herero, with or without a gun, with or without cattle, will be shot. I will no longer accept women and children. I will drive them back to their people, or I will let them be shot at. These are my words to the Herero people. The great general of the mighty Kaiser. End quote. This was not going to end well.
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire. But that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks. Active part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
General von Tota graciously clarified afterward, saying that he did not intend for his troops to shoot women and children, just to shoot over their heads to scare them away. But he also wrote this familiar-sounding rhetoric later. These tribes, quote, yield only to force. It was and remains my policy to apply this force by unmitigated terrorism and even cruelty, end quote. And cruel he was. Von Tota's soldiers hung Herero tribesmen right in front of their women. Those Herero not caught up in these mass executions died in the desert. Only 1% of Southwest Africa could even be farmed. But Bernhard von Bülow, the German chancellor at the time, did not think these mass executions were a good idea, and persuaded the Kaiser to pull back on these 2 months after von Tota's proclamation. Instead, the Kaiser ordered limited execution and forced labor for the rest of the Herero. Herero who defied long odds and survived these previous months started to trickle back into German settlements, submitting themselves to labor. At first, those Herero found their reward for returning in the form of getting arm, leg, and neck irons fastened around them. But the German chancellor soon got this policy dropped too. But von Bülow proposed another idea. The Herero should be placed in Konzentrationslager. The Herero should be guarded around the clock and required to work in concentration camps. General von Tota loved the idea, maybe as much as he loved Lord Horatio Kitchener. Von Tota held great respect for what Kitchener did in South Africa less than 5 years earlier. The Germans considered every Herero that entered their concentration camps as prisoners of war. Each Herero wore metal tags. Each of the tags was stamped. Each Herero ushered into cramped shelters. Many of the shelters were skin and rag huts, like the huts that blacks were herded into during the South African War a few years earlier. Many children worked as slaves for German officers. Adults worked hard labor for private companies and on military projects. The concentration camps at Windhoek held around 7,000 people. To give you an idea of how crammed this was, only 2,500 people lived in German Southwest Africa's capital. The Herero showed up to camp nothing like the colonial capital's residents would have. The Herero showed up after months of seeking refuge in the unforgiving desert. They showed up in rags, or even completely naked. Some missionaries described them as skeletons with hollow eyes. That is how these Herero showed up to camp. While working hard labor, they were given no blankets, sometimes no clothing, and slept on the marsh-like ground. Missionaries who initially lured these Herero out of hiding eventually tried to mitigate the Herero's suffering in these camps. But only so much could be done. These missionaries treated many skeletal prisoners for wounds dealt by rawhide whips from concentration camp guards. Despite the missionary presence, starvation savaged the Herero. Some saw 10 or more Herero dead, carried out of camp each day. One South African newspaper reported the following about camp labor. Quote, The loads are out of all proportion to their strength. I have often seen women and children dropping down, especially when engaged on this work, and also when carrying very heavy bags of grain, weighing 100 or more pounds. End quote. Diseases like dysentery that often accompany starvation ran rampant. What was worse, women were raped routinely, so sexually transmitted diseases like venereal typhoid joined the cocktail of camp diseases. When the Nama people rose up the next year, they too were thrown into these half-dozen camps that dotted southwest Africa, swelling the concentration camp population to 17,000. Shark Island sat just off the colony's coast. The concentration camp here earned a nickname from the German troops, Death Island. Here, too, prisoners were beaten by day, women and girls violated by night. Sick natives avoided the medical tent. Missionaries reported that those who went to the medical tent never came back. This gets darker. Some of those who died on Shark Island then had their heads cut off. Those severed heads went off-site, where German doctors could conduct experiments and develop race theories linking Africans the closest to apes. Word of Shark Island began to spread. One Protestant evangelist reported one account of a Herero man hearing he was being sent to Shark Island and decided to commit suicide by ripping open his neck with his bare hands. Soon, German authorities forbade anyone from telling the natives which camp they were being sent to, in order to avoid revolts or escape attempts. Missionaries desperately tried to save hundreds of Herero and Nama by appealing that they be transferred from Shark Island. The new colonial governor denied this request. He gave this cold rationale, quote, "Those prisoners transferred to Shark Island through trickery will not likely forget their time of imprisonment on the island any time soon. If they are let loose, they will spread their stories of hate and mistrust against us." End quote. Then, a new man took charge of the colonial army, Ludwig von Estorff. Estorff visited Shark Island and was horrified. He fought to transfer Shark Island detainees, but faced stiff resistance. Estorff fought for almost 2 years before he could shut the Shark Island camps down, and that wasn't until the native uprisings finally ceased. The death toll was staggering. Between the war, the mass executions, and the concentration camps, with their 45% death rate, 60,000 Herero and 10,000 Nama lost their lives. The Nama population slashed in half. The Herero, just a hair's width from extermination. When the German government resisted Estorff's efforts to shut down Shark Island earlier, they reminded Estorff, quote, "Britain has allowed 10,000 women and children to die in camps in South Africa." End quote. When I mention anything about the Boer Wars to people in person or on social media platforms, what I hear more than anything is some variation of this. "Oh, the British invented concentration camps during those wars." Is this true? The interwoven stories of this episode and the next will prove this British invented concentration camps assertion as either truth or myth. Before we shift to our next string of stories, let's define something of central importance: concentration camps. I think author Andrea Pitzer uses sufficient nuance when she cites political philosopher Hannah Arendt. Arendt put concentration camps into 3 camps: purgatory, Hades, and hell. From internment camps in the Netherlands, labor camps of the Gulag, to Nazi death camps. Pitzer writes, quote, "But nearly all concentration camps share one feature. They extract people from one area to house them somewhere else. Camps require the removal of a population from a society, with all its accompanying rights, relationships, and connections to humanity, This exclusion is followed by an involuntary assignment to some lesser condition or place, generally detention with other undesirables under armed guard. Of these afterworlds, Arendt writes, all three types have one thing in common. The human masses sealed off in them are treated as if they no longer existed, as if what happened to them were no longer of interest to anybody, as if they were already dead, and some evil spirit gone mad were amusing himself by stopping them for a while between life and death. End quote. On February 10th, 1896, a man standing a mere 5 feet tall stepped onto Cuban soil at Havana. Looking fiercely around with flared mutton chop sideburns to bear, this 47-year-old arrival from Madrid would earn infamy. He traveled 4,000 miles from Spain to cheering crowds, to streamers and garlands, to red blankets hoisted from windows, to assume command of Spanish forces in Cuba, to be the viceroy who the cheering crowds hoped would bring an end to the war, to be the harbinger of peace in Cuba. Before leaving Europe, this general did his due diligence. He had learned all he could from veterans of this ongoing war. A war began a year earlier by Cubans declaring independence from Spain. He settled on a strategy, one he knew would be controversial, but one he thought would win the war in less than 2 years. This new Governor General had a reputation. Newspapers in the Americas and in Europe predicted that he would bring, quote, bloodshed and mayhem. They were more right than they probably wanted to be. Cuban rebels this time raised money and foreign sympathy to great effect before and during this war. At first, General Arsenio Martinez Campos led Spanish forces. He seemed like the right fit. He'd fought for 5 years in the previous war. In that previous war, he had secured peace as colonial governor that eventually led to the abolition of slavery. General Martinez Campos served afterwards in Morocco and Mexico and led a coup that restored the monarchy in Spain. But all his experience and success before did not propel him to success in this current war with Cuban rebels. The rebels had immunity to malaria and yellow fever. Spanish forces did not. The rebels used guerrilla warfare tactics to perfection. Martinez Campos kept trying to set up a showdown on the battlefield, a decisive showdown that never came. The insurgents used outdated weapons to snipe fear into Spanish columns. They burned down homes and crops of those too loyal to the Spanish. They dynamited Spanish supplies and infrastructure. Yet these Cuban insurgents also would nurse wounded Spanish soldiers who fell into insurgent hands back to health and return them to the Spanish. Martinez Campos saw a route to victory, a route he was unwilling to take. He detailed what this route would take. Then he offered to resign as colonial governor because he could not bring himself to take this dishonorable route. General Martinez Campos wrote, quote, I cannot, as the representative of a civilized nation, be the first to give the example of cruelty and intransigence. End quote. What did General Martinez Campos find so cruel? Reconcentración. Even after Cuban insurgents committed to totally destroying all plantations, General Martinez Campos would not launch Reconcentración. Months later, crowds gathered at train stops all along General Martinez Campos's route to Madrid. They gathered to hurl insults at him. The Spanish government had recalled Martinez Campos in disgrace. Meanwhile, in Cuba, a man who, as a boy, watched with great fascination while his father performed surgeries and autopsies in the Spanish medical corps, that man completely burst the mold of Martinez Campos. Captain General Valeriano Vailer y Nicolau cast Martinez Campos's reservations aside. Ironically, Martinez Campos wrote his superiors earlier saying that of all the Spanish generals willing to use reconcentración, quote, only Weyler also has intelligence, valor, and an understanding of war, end quote. General Weyler had fought in Cuba decades before. He'd even won the lottery in Cuba, but then caught yellow fever. Weyler recovered enough to return to Cuba in 1868 and lead a band of Spanish loyalist volunteers in the 10 Years' War. Weyler won accolades for his bravery, but stories of his troops' savagery also spread. Stories of killing civilians. Stories of executions and beheadings. Stories of rapes. Weyler won the rank of brigadier general by the time he left Cuba. Weyler returned to Spain and fought rebels in the new Spanish Republic. He slaughtered civilians in Catalonia, in Spain. His reputation took a temporary hit, but he was deployed again across the Spanish Empire a couple more times, and brought back to fight dissenting anarchists and unionists in Spain. Now in Cuba for a third time, Weyler would stay true to character. Weyler demanded authorization to do whatever it took to win this war. Spanish authorities gave Weyler that blank check. General Weyler would aim to isolate the Cuban insurgents by herding all non-combatants into towns under Spanish control. That way, the Spanish could control these non-combatants and reconcentración camps. The day after he landed in Cuba, Weyler made his first speech to Cuban inhabitants and blamed civilians for the insurgents' success. Women and children weren't neutral. They were informing for Cuban insurgents. He later announced nearly 20 more categories of people who could be put on trial and be given the death penalty. Weyler announced reconcentración in a second proclamation. Everyone living in the countryside near Sancti Spiritus, Santiago, and Puerto Príncipe had to present themselves with identification papers to military authorities in the nearby cities. From then on, these country residents could not move from city to city without permission. Finally, Weyler declared that any insurgent captured in battle would be executed. The path that Martínez Campos knew but wouldn't take was finally being marched upon. U.S. newspapers continued their aggressive criticism of Weyler. The New York Times ran with the headline, Weyler's Draconic Laws. We will get to U.S. criticisms of Weyler later in our string of stories, though. Weyler did assemble a coterie of officers, a coterie capable of cruelty. Then, 3 months into his tenure, Weyler proclaimed that farmers had 20 days to deliver all of their grain to the Spanish army. 4 days later, Weyler's officials demanded all cattle be turned over, but promised 2 months of rations for civilians in Spanish-controlled towns, unless you were born to or married to an insurgent. Then you could starve for all the Spanish cared. These policies cut the Cuban insurgency at the knees. Previously friendly civilians grew more fearful and less helpful to the insurgency. The rebels grew more desperate for scarcer bullets and food. The rebels resorted more to terrorism and theft. The insurgents set ablaze many towns in the province of Pinar del Rio, thus driving more peasants into the arms of the Spanish, into the reconcentración zones. Some insurgent leaders made the cruel calculation that these rural residents that insurgents drove towards reconcentración zones would hurt the Spanish cause. These insurgent leaders reasoned that these refugees would hurt the Spanish cause by draining resources away from the Spanish war effort. The insurgents were wrong. These insurgents also had less to plunder because Weyler and company began burning everything outside reconcentración zones that the insurgents hadn't already burned. If the insurgents wanted to burn and devastate, Weyler would go way further. Then in October, Weyler tightened the screws on civilians. Transferring food without permission from the military authorities was forbidden. If you moved food from barbed wire reconcentration zone to reconcentration zone without permission, you died. Weiler decreed that anyone outside the reconcentration zones would, in 8 days, be considered a rebel, and thus treated like a rebel. Weiler extended this proclamation to the rest of Cuba by January. Some civilians didn't hear of these proclamations until after the prescribed 8-day allowances to move. Spanish troops appeared at many homes, giving a few hours' notice or no notice at all. Then, they would force everyone out at bayonet point towards their assigned reconcentration zone. Ironic to some of you, though not surprising to some of you, U.S.-based businesses supplied munitions and supplies to both the Spanish and the insurgents as this war raged on. The Spanish drove 300,000 civilians into their reconcentration camps. Local authorities in these reconcentration zones were supposed to build accommodations and set aside cultivation zones for these refugees. But for the most part, cultivation zones weren't arable and accommodations were non-existent. So what about the original residents of these towns inside the reconcentration zones? These residents typically did not welcome these peasants, who very well may have been supporting insurgents before. Those forced into the reconcentration zones slept in overcrowded barracks, in abandoned structures, or just on the ground. If they'd managed to bring personal items with them, city residents or Spanish soldiers often confiscated these possessions as the price for protection or shelter. These refugees faced starvation, open sewage, and mosquitoes carrying malaria. The refugees had the legal right to find employment, but few found any work. Some refugees risked getting shot to look outside the barbed wire zones for food. American journalist Richard Harding Davis toured 3 reconcentration zones. What he found must have wrecked him. It wrecks me more than 100 years later, as a new father. Harding saw unwalkable slums, ankle-deep in filth. Pitzer writes that Harding found, quote, hundreds of reconcentrados, huddled inside warehouses that straddled pools of sewage, with fungus growing up their walls. Dead bodies lay by the roadside. He saw babies, whose bones showed through as plainly as the rings under a glove, covered in sores that made their mother's touch excruciating. End quote. Yellow press outlets took the tragedy up a fictitious notch to sell even more papers. Quote, blood on the roadsides, blood in the fields, blood on the doorsteps, blood, blood, blood. The old, the young, the weak, the crippled, all are butchered without mercy. End quote. What bothered Weiler were these exaggerations and fiction spread by American newspapers. What didn't bother Weiler was what he was actually doing to lead thousands to suffer and die horribly. But Weiler's waging of war was indeed winning the war. The cost be damned. What actually was happening in Cuba was making the government in Madrid nervous, and the U.S. government and public more inclined to intervene. Suddenly, someone was assassinated. Antonio Cánovas del Castillo relaxed at a spa one day until an Italian anarchist murdered this conservative prime minister of Spain. A more liberal government formed in Spain. Weiler heard rumors across the Atlantic that his command would be stripped away. Weiler demanded confirmation of his command or to otherwise be immediately relieved of his command. While he waited, Weiler sought to, quote, finish war with war, to avoid concessions and treaties and completely break the insurgency. Weiler cited General Sherman's scorched earth policy in the American South as a necessary part of the road to Union victory in that American Civil War. 3 weeks after Weiler demanded a decision regarding his command, the new liberal government in Spain recalled Weiler. Captain General Ramon Blanco replaced Weiler, General Blanco made declarations aiming to be, or at least look, more humane. But reconcentrados continued to die in swarms. The insurgents only worsened these poor people's plight by torching any cultivation zones they could reach. U.S. citizens spent weeks gathering millions of pounds of food to send to the starving. The American Red Cross, with the famous battlefield nurse Clara Barton, went to distribute the aid and care for the reconcentrados, these long beleaguered concentration camp victims. Some concentration camp victims survived long enough to see this aid arrive, only to die from eating simple meals. Tender, intentional care had to be given before simply feeding these starving reconcentrados. People cursed General Weyler long after he left Cuba. Many Spanish loyalists, though, saw him as a hero who would have finally defeated the insurgents if the Spanish government and the humanitarians could have just gotten out of the way. Officers who supported Weyler destroyed the printing press of the newspaper El Reconcentrado in Cuba. Voicing concern for the safety of U.S. citizens in Cuba, the McKinley presidency sent the USS Maine to dock outside Havana, just in case things got out of hand. Some were surprised when Havana did not riot. The USS Maine's captain tried to ease tension by allowing townspeople aboard for tours, by hosting mutual toasts to the health of both Spain and Cuba, and by hosting the Secretary General of Cuba, along with other Spanish officials aboard. Then, February 15th happened. 50,000 people lined the parade route on the day of the funeral that followed. Some reconcentrados asked to carry the coffins of the dead American soldiers. Instead, 400 of these reconcentrados were only allowed to walk behind the funeral procession. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," rang out across the United States. Few knew then why the USS Maine exploded and sank that February 15th. But Spanish treatment of the reconcentrados, Spanish waging of war against insurgents, had primed the American public for a war with Spain. Blaming the Spanish for the sinking of the USS Maine made it all the easier for Congress to declare war on Spain. When President McKinley called for war with Spain, he made sure to highlight the reconcentración zones, the Spanish concentration camps. Quote, "The unfortunates, being for the most part women and children with aged and helpless men, enfeebled by disease and hunger, could not have tilled the soil without tools, seed, or shelter for their own support or for the supply of the citizens. Reconcentración, adopted avowedly as a war measure in order to cut off the resources of the insurgents, worked its predestined result. As I said in my message last December, it was not civilized warfare, it was extermination. The only peace it could beget was that of the wilderness and the grave." End quote. On April 25th, 1898, the U.S. declared war on Spain. By then, tens of thousands of men, women, children, and babies had already starved to death in the Spanish concentration camps. Some estimates placed the death toll as high as 500,000, though current estimates place the number of those dead men, women, and children at around 150,000. The mortality rates of these Spanish concentration camps ranged between 25 and 40%. Now, lest you think that General Weyler was the first to use concentration camps, think again. About 25 years earlier, the Spanish fought Cuban insurgents for years. So many years that this war is known as the Great War or the 10 Years' War. After this war broke out in 1868, the Spanish struggled to find success against insurgents for years. Then, Brigadier General Jose Maria Velasco suggested an economizing idea. Why not concentrate the rural population into several camps so that more Spanish troops could be freed up from patrolling all over Cuba? Instead, far fewer Spanish could be allocated to guarding these reconcentración zones, and then far more Spanish could be devoted to finding and fighting insurgents. By reconcentrating these rural civilians, the insurgents would have less people to recruit, less people to spy for them, and less people to cultivate food for them. The Spanish government adopted Brigadier General Velasco's suggestions in early 1872. Rural civilians were reconcentrated for the first time. More pieces fell into place before the Spanish could finally declare victory against Spanish insurgents in this 10-year war, but a precedent of reconcentration was set. As a side note, can you imagine being someone who survived the first reconcentration policies of the 10 Years' War, only to have to face reconcentration again in the rebellion that came about 20 years later? That is a hard life. In the final clash between the Spanish and the Cuban insurgents, both the Spanish and the insurgents waged total war. But the Spanish, with about 10 times as many soldiers in the field, did the most harm. This horrible harm to Cuban civilians paved the road to the Spanish-American War. Most of you not familiar with the Spanish-American War that followed probably deduced quite easily that the United States emerged victorious. What I doubt you would predict is the feeling of déjà vu that will wash over you when you hear how the Philippines were won. If you would like to help keep Forgotten Wars producing and growing, would you do at least 2 of 3 things? First, would you share a link to the podcast with someone you think might enjoy it? Second, if you're listening on Spotify, Google Podcasts, or other providers, would you make sure to like or follow our podcast? If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, would you give us a 5-star rating and write a thoughtful review there? You can even do that while you're listening. Lastly, if you want more from the show, bonus episodes, behind-the-mic access, transcripts and sources, and much more, and you want to support the show, check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/ForgottenWars. That is patreon.com/ForgottenWars. The link is also in this episode's notes. Thanks to those of you who have done one of these things already. Know that you're appreciated.